Panel discussion is a very talented journalist. Kristina Peterson covers food and agricultural policy at the Wall Street Journal's Washington Bureau. She's written about food composting startups, potatoes' status as a vegetable, dietary guidelines on dairy, oversight of infant formula manufacturers, and many other food topics, while also covering a broad TikTok and many other topics. Kristina, thank you for being here. We'll go until 9:50.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, I will briefly introduce our panel. To my left is Roberta Wagner. She's the Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for the International Dairy Foods Association. She previously worked at the Consumer Brands Association as an Assistant Administrator of the Office of Policy and Program Development at the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, and spent more than 25 years at the FDA. To her left is Barbara Kowalcyk, an associate professor in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences and director of the Food Policy Institute at George Washington University. Her research has spanned a range of topics related to food safety and infectious foodborne disease. She also has more than a decade of experience as a biostatistician conducting clinical research and providing support to data safety monitoring boards in the pharmaceutical industry. And last but not least, we have Peter Lurie, the President and Executive Director of the Center for Science and the Public Interest. He previously worked at the FDA, where he was the Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy and Analysis. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So I thought we could start with the topic of the FDA's overhaul. Following criticism after the nationwide baby formula shortages, the FDA reorganized the agency's food division. So far, how would you guys rate this overhaul? Have you seen any significant changes in its operations so far? Roberta, do you want to start?
Sure. Is this on automatically? I think so. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. So first of all, and I'll call him Jim because I do know Jim, as Jim said, the reorganization has not been cleared yet. Implementation has not started. But with that said, the FDA hasn't been standing still relative to its human foods program. They have been looking at the recommendations of the expert panel. And some of the things that they have done and some of the positive changes that we have noticed from the industry side, I'm going to share real quickly. So first of all, they have moved the Office of Food Policy and Emergency Response. This was Frank Giannis's office, for lack to explain, and it sat in the Office of the Commissioner. That has been moved under the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, which will eventually be called the Human Foods Program. It has also appointed a deputy commissioner, and this is a really big deal in my opinion, because we now have a single lead for the Human Foods Program. He is the ultimate decision maker. They are moving away from this consensus decision model for the Human and Animal Foods Program, which honestly, in my opinion, caused a state of paralysis relative to decision making and action at the agency. So we have a leader now for the Human Foods Program. He has been given the authority and the accountability for the program. He makes decisions on behalf of the program. And I have to say, he's made some unpopular decisions and doesn't have a problem doing that. So he is the right person for the job. I would say governance has been reestablished for its Human and Animal Foods Program, but really the Human Foods Program. Jim leads the governance board. It includes representatives from leadership and management across the Human and Animal Foods Program. So Office of Regulatory Affairs is at the table. That's the inspection arm. Center for Vet Medicine is at the table, as well as the CFSAN management team. With that said, they raise issues, they talk about issues, they can opine, but the decisions are made by Jim. So there isn't a roadblock in decision making. And I'll close so other folks can talk. The other positive changes we've seen with the agency is much improved and enhanced consumer engagement, transparency, customer service is at an all-time high. I even had one of the divisions at CIFSAN say we could contact their subject matter experts directly when we have questions, and they gave us a list of the subject matter experts, what their areas of expertise were, and their email addresses. So instead of sending you to an email inbox, which was the kind of the way they did things, or the technical assistance network, they said contact our subject matter experts directly. So those are the few of the positive changes we've noticed from the industry side.
One of the issues that was highlighted in an independent report was the challenge changing the workforce culture at the FDA. How have you guys seen that going, and how much of a challenge do you believe that that will be?
Does this okay, it does automatically go on. All right. Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to echo many of the comments that Roberta made. I had the privilege of sitting on the Reagan-Udall panel with Jim, and that was a really great experience in terms of, I think the work we did was really impactful and has led to some significant changes, and I agree with Roberta that they're not sitting on their hands waiting for things to be formalized. But that said, one of the things that we did here, and I think most of us who have worked with FDA, at least on the food safety side for a long time, recognize that there are some significant cultural issues within the agency that need to be addressed. And I would have to say that's probably one of the biggest challenges I see facing Jim and the leadership at FDA. There is, in my opinion, there's somewhat, and I'm one of the few people that have actually worked with FDA on both sides of the house, both drugs and in food. And I think that there is kind of a mentality that you regulate food the same way you regulate drugs, and that is really not the case. It's a very different kind of beast, and I think that that's one of the biggest challenges, is changing that mentality among the workforce. I think the restructuring of the Human Foods Program under a single leadership, I think also the Office of Regulatory Affairs and giving the Human Foods Program oversight, or at least leadership over that, is really important. But I'm also very concerned about resources for the agency given the current fiscal climate. One of the challenges for FDA, in my opinion, and I'll stop here so that Peter can have an opportunity to respond, is the drug user fees and the imbalance that can create with the food, on the food budget. And so when I hear about FDA's budget being cut, I start to worry about the differential impact that that's going to have on the foods program, and how are we going to manage that given the increasingly complex nature of our global food supply and these emerging issues that we're seeing, although they're not really emerging. Cronobacter and baby formula and lead and spices are not new issues, but they're being brought to the forefront. So I would have to say that culture is probably the biggest challenge that's going to be hard to overcome, especially with limited resources.
So sitting over here, I'm thinking about my son's report card, which is peppered with a bunch of things called WSs. So I quickly texted him. I asked him what it stood for, and he said it's waiting submission. And I think that might, in fact, be a fair grade at the moment for FDA. I think that, what Roberta said is true. The agency is clearly not waiting for all the boxes to be signed off on by HHS and OMB. But the boxes themselves are interesting, and I think what's been done is by and large good. I know there are people in this room who imagined a deputy commissioner for food that would have been more far-reaching than was ultimately decided upon, including really a good hunk of ORA, Office of Regulatory Affairs, and the Veterinary Medicine Center. I personally never felt that that was the right thing to do, and I thought that FDA got the boxes about right in this reorg. Most importantly, it got away with this rather absurd situation of having these two deputy commissioners. I think that's a solved problem. And I think that it's correct to leave CVM on its own, in as much as the vast majority of what CVM does not relate to human foods, and so putting that under human food deputy does not make sense to me. But there is something that came out of this reorg that I don't think is adequately appreciated, and I think maybe Barbara and I worked sort of food and drugs appreciate this a little bit better, and that is that it forced an overall rethinking of this Office of Regulatory Affairs, which is FDA's inspectorate, which had really operated as a kind of independent entity all over the country with district offices and so on. And I think that it had always been out of whack. They'd always acted too independently. There was not enough agenda setting centrally in Washington. And the result is that they were just too much on their own, doing the inspections a little bit too, sort of by the book. And so what has happened because of the look at the food program is much of that authority, especially in budget setting and priority setting, is now going to be with the Deputy Commissioner for Food. That's all to the good for food, but better still is that it's going to reverberate through the entire agency, and that kind of rethinking of the relationship between all of FDA's other functions, be they in tobacco, medical devices, drugs, biologics, that whole balance is going to be rejiggered, and I think that that's all for the best.
One of the more alarming incidents last year was the detection of high levels of lead in applesauce consumed by babies and kids. And Deputy Commissioner Jones talked about sort of the question of imports and how that should be looked at. When we were discussing this panel, Barbara used the phrase the Wild West of spices. So maybe you could kick us off, Barbara. What does that tell us about any weaknesses in the food safety system, and what should the FDA be doing here?
So, I mean, and I'm actually going to eventually defer to Roberta because she knows a lot more about imports than I do. But I think that, we've known that spices, and spices are largely imported into the United States, have had these kinds of problems. I mean, they've been putting lead in spices for a while, and if you don't know, spices are sold by weight, and that's why you put lead in them, because then they weigh more. They can also add color to the spices, and I've worked internationally and seen some production of spices, and it is concerning. So I think one of the challenges that we have, and I'm going to come back to the fiscal oversight, the fiscal budget that FDA has, is they have a huge number of importers that they have to manage and regulate. And how do you do that in an effective way with limited resources? And I think that this is just bringing back the forefront. I think there's going to have to be more emphasis on the FSMA regulations related to import verification. I'll let Roberta.
Sure. I mean, I always like to throw out the import statistics, and I did look these up. So FDA gets over 18 million lines of food, imported food entries a year. So they got to review 18 million lines of food. They are able to do about 1,600 to 1,700 foreign food facility inspections, which sounds like a big number, but there's over 170,000 registered foreign food facilities. So they are just, they really can't rely on some of their traditional tools, such as sampling at the border, doing physical exams at any high percentage, or even expecting, I don't know that in their entire, in the next 2 decades, we can actually get out to every foreign facility that imports food into the United States, let alone all the farms. So just, put this in perspective here. That is why FSMA gave us FSVP. And quite frankly, during this situation, first of all, kudos to FDA for putting out a public health alert based on a state laboratory result, a state lab that did not use an official method. So this has always been very difficult for FDA. They reviewed the work. They said it met their standards, even though it was an official method. And quite frankly, in the past, what would have happened is FDA would have gone out behind the states, collected their own samples, used an official method, and waited to alert the public until they had their own results confirmed and all the T's crossed and I's dotted. So kudos to FDA for that. I think what I found very concerning is they immediately moved to their old tools for import oversight. Let's send a team to Ecuador. Let's sample more cinnamon at the border. What about FSVP? That final rule has been out since 2015. If these importers are not complying with that rule and are not verifying that their suppliers are meeting standards that either meet or exceed our public health safety standards, then why are they not on import alert? That was the thing I found very concerning. And I did raise this to the agency just because that's who I am. I said, what about FSVP? Why aren't importers being put on import alert? And so out of this whole situation, what I would say to FDA is you need to enhance your oversight of these importers, put more resources there. They have a responsibility now because of FSMA.
Well, first let me say that I'm disappointed to see the sort of spread of this term, the Wild West of spices, because I thought the Wild West belonged to us in the dietary supplement field. So, anyway, doesn't make it incorrect. No, I agree with what Roberta and Barbara said. That's all very good. You can't inspect your way out of this problem. The FDA inspects, somewhere around 1% of all the imports, and you can double that or triple that, and you're still not going to be anywhere near a significant fraction. I think that what we really need to be doing is thinking more about our foreign counterparts here and trying to get them up to snuff as well. And some of that, I think FDA did do under a previous commissioner in the drug side, but I'm not aware of the same kinds of efforts on the food side. And one can be sure that under the previous administration, there was very little interest in building up the infrastructure of foreign countries. So I think that that's a real opportunity, and ultimately, just because of the transition to a substantially foreign supplied food supply is not something that's going to be reversed. So what we're going to have to do is build up everybody else if we're going to want to protect ourselves.
At the end of Deputy Commissioner Jones's question period, we were talking about the GRAS, the generally regarded as safe system, and he said he was viewed it as something of a weakness, but thought that most manufacturers were voluntarily submitting. Is that something that you three would agree with? Do you agree with that assessment of that piece of the food additive system?
Well, certainly nobody's really in a position that they can make that kind of a statement with any kind of confidence because the fact is nobody really knows. That's the fact. And nobody knows what the denominator of GRAS substances is. And I think, it's a patently absurd situation to put FDA in a place where it has to regulate a market that it cannot define. And that's where we are. We don't know what's in the food supply, and so we cannot know what we do not know. So, I think that this effort in New York is a really very interesting, brave, and creative one. And, if it actually comes to pass, we'll actually learn the answer to the question, assuming, again, that the companies actually comply with the New York law, which is, I suppose up for grabs. But we'll certainly learn something about what the underbelly is and what's not available to us. I also want to say, though, that this is not something that happened to FDA, as a result of, the Congress, which was a little bit the way, Deputy Commissioner Jones put it. This is a self-injury by the FDA. I mean, it's back in '97 that FDA went and changed the guidance on this that allowed companies to self-certify in these panels that are often subject to conflict of interest without even telling the FDA that it happened. That was an FDA decision, and therefore, at least in principle, subject to reverse by the agency.
Generally speaking, the FDA looks to be taking a more assertive role in this. Do you think that is because they were pressured by the states? And what do you expect to see on the FDA from this? This has traditionally taken quite a long time. Do you expect to see an accelerated pace here of the review of food chemicals?
So, I'm willing to concede that, going the state route is not our first choice. And I understand the logic of having a central federal authority that has responsibility over additives and takes the burden off the states. But at the point that the FDA is dropping the ball in the way that it has, it's totally understandable that a state might step in, and it's totally understandable that a group like ours might help a state to step in, because a chemical like red dye number 3 was determined by the FDA to be a carcinogen in 1990, okay, and it was taken out of topical products, but somehow left in food and ingested drugs. The agency said it would do something, nothing happened. So, we feel that our hands are tied here. We have to turn to the states. So I think there are two ways that FDA takes action, notwithstanding some recent attention from the deputy commissioner. The one is if there's pressure from the states, and I do think that will make a difference. The second is if the chemical is actually not in use. And at the point that the chemical is actually not being used, FDA suddenly gets brave and said, all right, well, let's go and take that one off the market. And that's often what happens.
Yeah, I guess I could add, and we've been actually having some communications with the agency around this. Industry likes GRAS. I'm just going to tell you that. It allows them to innovate, and without innovation, they can't grow and thrive or even survive. So that is one of the impetus. I would say there is a red book out there. They know what they need to do around GRAS substances. Some would disagree with me, but I believe the majority of them do that. Has FDA ever, proactively gone out there and asked for their documentation in support of GRAS determinations? Not that I'm aware of, unless it's a situation where they actually have intel that there's science to support a look at that GRAS substance. So what industry has been doing, and we did just submit some proposed recommendations to the agency. We agree, and Jim has said this in other venues, that you have the pre-market side of the house. So that's for safety determinations that FDA conducts on food and color additives, food contact materials, and substances. That you have that side of the house, and then reassessment. So these things are approved, but the science is evolving and changing, and we're learning every day. So there needs to be a post-market reassessment focus as well. So you have the pre-market side of the house, you need dedicated resources for post-market reassessments, and they need to be proactive. I would argue that the list that FDA puts up is driven completely by the consumer and environmental groups, the NGOs, and honestly, their tactics, and I can't say I disagree with them. If they don't get timely action out of the agency, they move to the states. That is what is happening now. We prefer a proactive agenda. Perhaps there's some sort of nomination process on a periodic basis. Those nominations can come in from all stakeholders as well as FDA, who should be doing their own robust monitoring of the science and risk assessments. So if there are substances that have been approved or that are deemed GRAS, and the science is telling them that these things potentially are not safe, they should be monitoring for that. They should nominate things for a proactive priority list for reassessment. So have a nomination process. I know folks, advisory committees can get bogged down in bureaucracy, but have an expert, advisory committee that reviews the nominations, come up with a proactive and not just reactive priority list, and then give FDA the resources to actually do post-market reassessments of these chemicals or food substances. And that is everything from food and color additives, food contact materials, and GRAS substances. So just to give you a light into what industry is thinking and some of the recommendations we're making to the agency, and we would support additional funding for the agency for that type of work.
So I'm not an expert in GRAS or food additives, so I'm a little reluctant to step in here, but my background is epidemiology and biostatistics. So I think that this is where it's really important that we have more robust surveillance systems that are integrated, that aren't just looking at one type of pathogen or hazard in the food, but are actually integrated, and I think that that's an area that FDA really needs to enhance. And actually, you need it enhanced across several agencies, CDC, the state and locals. We saw a lot of improvement in public health capacity and surveillance efforts during the pandemic, but that is now going away. The other piece that I just wanted to follow up on Roberta's comment around advisory committees. I think it's really important under the previous administration. They got the FDA Food Advisory Committee was disbanded, and one of the recommendations we made in the Reagan-Udall report was the reestablishment of that. I think that the Federal Advisory Committee system is not being as utilized as it could be in these areas, and it gives the agencies, and I'm going to say agencies because I think this is not a problem unique to FDA, the agencies the opportunity to solicit that feedback in a public arena, and I think that that's very important.
Right, 36 advisory committees for drugs, 0 for food. That's the situation.
I believe we just had our first Easter with marshmallow peeps that did not contain red dye 3. Given how many my toddlers consumed, that's probably a good thing. Could you guys talk a little bit about reformulation and to what extent that's a solution for some of these controversial food additives?
Well, I think reformulation is the solution for much more than food additives. I mean, reformulation is also a solution when it comes to nutrition as well. So the idea is either to force the hand of industry to do so or to create a set of incentives to which they will respond. It is almost always going to be true that depending upon human behavior to have people advance their health is going to be the tough road. It's almost always true. If you want to go and get a blood transfusion, it's probably not a good idea to, ask the recipient to say, well, ask a series of questions of the blood bank and make sure that they've screened for HIV or mad cow disease, right? You probably don't want to do that. What you want is a product that you know to be safe, and the patient is in a place where they passively can depend upon the government, and they know what they're going to get, and there's no behavior change required from them. That's where we need to get with food. We need to get to a place through things like, front to pack, where if the companies are pushed to reformulate, or even in sodium, as Mike was saying, if the companies will reformulate, it takes the onus of the consumer to have to go and look at the pack and to make these kinds of very complicated scientific and personal decisions for their families. So I think that's where we need to be headed. And when we have that and we have a trust in government that's well earned, then I think we'll be in a much better place when it comes to additives and nutrition.
Barbara?
Yeah. So I'm just going to jump off of there. I think one of the things that FDA really, and I think we need to do more broadly, is the integration of food safety and nutrition, right? Because sometimes there are unintended consequences when you make changes in one area versus another area. And of course, exposure to foodborne pathogens reduces the body's ability to absorb nutrients, can cause chronic illness in and of itself that makes people more susceptible to foodborne illness. There's not a whole lot of research been done in this, but I'll probably turn it over to Roberta again, but the sodium issue is always really interesting because, when we start talking about reformulation, and I am not a food scientist, but some of the things that we do in food science are done to prevent the growth of pathogens in the food during transportation, storage, and so forth. And so we have to be mindful, right, of those unintended consequences that we have. Similarly, for example, I'm doing some work there's a lot of effort going on around reducing salmonella in poultry, right? And why am I talking about poultry? FDA doesn't regulate poultry. But one of the conversations we have to have, or we are having, is if we set the standards too strict, then we will have a large proportion of poultry being diverted from the market, and that would potentially cause nutrition and food security issues. And so we need to have those conversations about those trade-offs. And in my experience, we're not having them. Nutrition and food safety tend to be too siloed, and I'm hoping that FDA will start to help bridge that gap. But I think that there's some trade-offs there we need to consider.
Can I jump in? Is that okay?
Okay, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to give an example of where I do believe FDA did exactly that. And that, I think, is in sodium. So what the agency did was, it didn't just say, reduce sodium, in some kind of broad way. What it did was it took a look at eventually 163 separate categories of food that were the largest contributors to the sodium supply in this country. And they looked at them individually. They figured out what the distribution of sodium was within that category of products. And then they considered the function of sodium in that product, because you're right, sometimes they have antibacterial activity, for example. And they tried to develop a target, for 2 years and maybe someday for 10 or something in between. But they tried to develop a target that took that into account. So it is done sometimes, I just want to say, and I think that in the case of sodium, in that respect at least, it was rather well done.
Yeah, and I can add to that a little bit since I represent the dairy industry, and so we make cheese. And of course, there's a lot of salt in cheese, and there's functional reasons for having salt. And there's actually standards of identity that require certain amounts of salt in these cheese types. And so we've had some really great conversations with FDA, and this is where we're starting to see kind of the industry, academics, and the agency working together better. We actually commissioned research with the University of Wisconsin to determine how low can you go with salt, and it's by standardized, certain standardized and unstandardized cheeses. We shared the study protocol with FDA. We got feedback, and we're going to share the data with them. So when they're setting their next targets, for certain cheese types, it may be they've gone as low as they can go. And I can tell you our industry has been reformulating. The signals around sodium, the need to reduce sodium, came long before the short-term sodium reduction targets, and industry has been reformulating. A lot of times they don't even make it known to consumers because there is research that suggests that as soon as you label something low sodium or consumers think there's less sodium in a particular product, that they might be less likely to consume. So again, I think reformulation, industry does this all the time. They take their signals from the policymakers. You're setting short-term sodium targets, but I can remember attending a salt conference with FDA probably 2 decades ago now. So this is really nothing new. I think, relative to, reformulation, these food substances are put into foods to have usually for some functional purpose, and you have to remember that. And if you remove them, you have to ask the question, am I removing them and now the quality of the food is not going to be there? The shelf life is 1 day and not 5 days. The food safety is an issue. I mean, there's a lot that goes behind reformulation. It takes time. I would argue that if FDA had a proactive regulatory agenda in the reassessment, kind of the post-market reassessment space, that sends a signal to industry. Industry will start looking at that group of chemicals. Are there alternatives out there? Let's start testing the alternatives. Maybe the alternatives might cause more harm than good. I mean, all of that takes time. And if industry or if FDA is signaling, we probably don't want you using these chemicals, and even that priority list sends that message, they will try to figure out alternatives, and they do need a phase-out period. That is the only thing. So reformulation, our industry does this all the time. This is R&D. They're working on this all the time. They take their signals from the policymakers.
Right, except for those times when the Dairy Association is providing signals to the policymakers that prefer that reformulation not take place. And here I'm thinking of riders that have cropped up in the Congress that have made it difficult for FDA to finalize these rules. Riders that have had to do with sodium content of cheese that were proposed in the last Congress. I get it, it's complicated, and that's why I made a case for what FDA did. But then, I guess I would say to you, let's let them do their job, and let's not turn to Congress for solutions, to the industry's parochial interests, especially if it might be at the expense of, enhanced or increased sodium exposure to children.
And I know what you're talking about, and that's a very difficult situation. So with nutrient-dense dairy is underconsumed grossly in this country. And quite frankly, to get kids to eat nutrient-dense dairy, think about your yogurts and even cheeses, they have to taste good. And, you know, our fear with the school meal program is basically setting a weekly target for sodium in the child's diet. What's the easy thing to do? Take off the slice of cheese. Don't serve cheese at breakfast. Don't put a slice of cheese on a hamburger. That is why we did what we did. I mean, it's just the easy solution, honestly, to reduce sodium in that weekly allotment.
Yeah.
Is to take that slice of cheese off of the sandwich. Don't put it with the eggs.
I'm kind of interested in those kind of easy
Yeah.
solutions, to be honest with
So.
you.
Could we shift a little bit to front of pack labeling? What do you expect, when do you expect to see something from the FDA on this? And what level of expectations do you have around how effective it will be in helping shape people's shopping or consumption?
So I could start. I mean, I think FDA has made it very clear their two goals for front-of-pack nutrition labeling is to kind of trigger and not pressure, but kind of force reformulation, or to, you know, again, get the companies to reformulate out added sugars, sodium, saturated fat. So that's one. And then the other one is to reduce chronic-related or food-related chronic disease. And so the reformulation lever we get, we're hearing loud and clear what we need to do on that side. My question is, how in the world is FDA actually going to measure a reduction in food-related chronic disease? And we've asked that many, many times. So, and I would say again, for nutrient-dense dairy products, our products will bear essentially what is a warning symbol. And these foods are underconsumed today, and they will be further underconsumed if they have to bear a warning symbol. We have, with several other industry trade associations, we support the Facts Up Front program. It is a balanced program. It includes nutrients to encourage and nutrients to limit, plus some other things. And that way, yes, if there's a negative attribute to a nutrient-dense food, the positive attribute is also shared. So, but what we expect, quite frankly, is probably the high-end Canadian model is what I think we're expecting at this point.
Yeah, so I think, you know, this is one of the very great opportunities before the FDA, and they've committed to do it. And there are clear signals that they're moving forward. There have been meetings. There's been research that's been conducted. It's dragging out a little bit. In fairness, we had expected something in the spring. Now it's in the regulatory agenda for the summer. I just hope they get it out. You know, it's not easy to do. Having been on the other side of this, the agency is subject to one of the federal government's most misnamed statutes, the Paperwork Reduction Act, which has the net effect of increasing paperwork. And but still, I think that there's a real sincere and good faith effort there to drive this forward. And, you know, I'm hoping that we'll see benefits in two respects. One will be better informed consumers, and the other is some pressure upon industry to reformulate. You know, Barbara, Roberta, I think you're right. You know, it's going to be very difficult to measure that. I'm not sure that that's, at the end of the day, due to the complexity of these diseases that are only partially caused by diet, after all, like cardiovascular disease, that should be the standard. To me, there have been evaluations that have been done in foreign countries that have tried FOP that provide, in our view, enough evidence for effectiveness, short of proving reductions in disease. You know, better informing, better purchasing decisions, and then ultimately reformulation in at least some instances.
Oh, I was going to add two things. First of all, I know there was a comment, I think Thomas made it earlier, you know, where countries have adopted front-of-pack nutrition labeling and research shows some successes, they have piggybacked it with other policy changes. And some of that have been taxes on certain types of foods, places, the marketing to kids, things like that. So I do question whether just putting out front-of-pack nutrition labeling, not that I'm suggesting we do the other things, but I think where they've seen successes, they've piggybacked front-of-pack nutrition labeling with other policies. And for dairy, I represent dairy, of course, we have approached the agency and said, if you look at what Canada did with the high-end, they had to carve out nutrient-dense dairy categories that contain so much calcium. They are exempt from front-of-pack nutrition labeling, and we told the agency we don't support that. We would prefer a policy that applies to dairy. We don't want to carve out, but they have to very carefully craft the policy so that such carve-outs aren't necessary.
I think we're going to take audience questions in a few minutes, but just before we do, we have 3 food safety experts here. Has that changed at all the way that you handle food in your own home? I let my children basically lick raw cookie dough off the floor, but I don't let them come near a cutting board with chicken on it. Should I be revising my own methodology? Barbara?
So, yes, obviously, I have, being a food safety expert has changed the way I look at food in the home. If you're not aware, I was also personally impacted by foodborne disease and lost my 2.5-year-old son, Kevin, in 2001 from an E. coli 0157H7 infection. So I have a very low risk tolerance. But there are foods that many food safety experts, and planning a meal for a bunch of food safety experts is always interesting. I can say the things that I don't eat, and there's I'm very careful, and it depends on the population that's consuming it. So children, pregnant and postpartum women, senior citizens, and anyone with a compromised immune system are at higher risk of serious illness and death. So high-risk foods like, honestly, leafy greens, and we have to figure out how to deal with leafy greens. We want people to consume more leafy greens, but it's also one of the riskiest products because you tend not to cook it. And so how do we do that in a way that promotes health and well-being among our population? And I think that's one of the big challenges we're facing. And before I pass it off, because I have the mic for a minute, I do want to just say that my personal opinion is that we need to build food safety and food safety culture across the food system, from farm to fork. And I say to physician because we need healthcare practitioners to be more aware of food safety issues. But out of the entire system, consumers have the least amount of control. So it's really on us, those of us working in government, those of us working in academia, in the industry, on behalf of the public, to do our part. Because, as I've often said, if a company with microbiologists and standard operating procedures and the regulators with their microbial testing and their inspectors couldn't handle it, why on earth would you think a consumer armed with kitchen cleaner and a meat thermometer would be able to do it? And so, I take that attitude in my home and in my kitchen and try to reduce the risk for my family, particularly those that are at high risk. Sorry to be on my soapbox, but I'll pass it off now.
I'm happy to take some questions.
Sure. So I worked at FDA for 28 years and USDA's FSIS for 5 years. I managed some of the biggest foodborne outbreaks this country has had during the time in both of those places. I can say as a kid, my mom would send me out to the backyard to pick fruit off the tree as my snack and to pick vegetables out of my garden. We didn't wash them off. We just ate them straight from the tree, straight out of the garden. My mom also gave me raw meat with a little bit of raw hamburger meat with a little bit of salt on it as a treat. And she let me lick the cake batter bowl and the cookie dough bowl. So to this day, now knowing what I know now, I kind of wonder if she was trying to kill me. But anyway, I can tell you I raised two young men now, and they did none of that. We wash our fruits and vegetables, raw fruits and vegetables. If I'm buying bagged anything, vegetables, I read the directions because, some of them you're not supposed to wash again, and there's a reason for that. I don't wash my turkey. I don't wash my chicken. I follow all the safe food handling and prep. I read the box now. I want to know, is this a ready to cook? Is this a cooked item? What am I doing when I'm heating it up? Am I trying to kill pathogens, or am I just heating it up because it's already been cooked? All of those things just stick with me. The other thing, working on the meat side, I ask when I'm at chain restaurants and I want a steak, I ask them if it's tenderized. I want to know, because if it is, I'm eating that well done, and I'm not going to eat it rare. People don't, these are things we pick up along the way that just stick with us. So yeah, I definitely, absolutely, I look at things differently. And I would also say I do sit on the board for Stop Foodborne Illness, and that is because I care so very deeply about food safety, and I don't ever want to see a consumer to getting sick if we can prevent it.
So if it says triple washed, we do not need to wash it again?
Well, it usually says do not wash.
Okay, if it
Like
says do not wash,
says.
we do not need to wash.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Anyone has one? Oh.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rita Stevens. I represent DC Central Kitchen as an admin training specialist. And you all mentioned earlier, while we were talking about sodium, regulations on the nutrient and how to regulate it. And I was wondering your opinion on, I think, Roberta, you mentioned taxing. I know there's like a sugar tax on some sodas, and that's sort of been a debate with a lot of people. Historically, I've worked with a lot of populations where they may not have been considered as privileged as others, and where some food can be scarce. So I was wondering what your opinions are on taxing food and taxing nutrients like that. And is it fair? Is it not fair? Just wondering what you have to say about that.
Our organization has been in favor of taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, and we still are. Unfortunately, the momentum has dried up a little bit in the last few years, I would say. But certainly, if you look at other parts of public health, taxation is very often one of the most effective interventions of all. If you look at tobacco, probably more than anything else, it's the rising rates of taxation that ultimately drove down tobacco consumption rates more than all these building requirements, more than warning labels, all the rest of it. So we still think that there's a place for that. That said, however, sugar-sweetened beverages are not the be-all and end-all of sugar exposure in this country. In fact, in part because of the work of people in this room, the SSB consumption is going down. Sometimes to be replaced by alternative products like teas and energy drinks. But we do need to look more and more at other parts of the food supply where sugar originates from, including some of these very pastries we had this morning. Which is why we filed a petition with FDA to take a look at the sugar supply in this country in much the way that it's looking at the sodium supply to develop a voluntary standard. So, yeah.
I think Roberta might have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I would say we, industry, and I speak for them today, we are pro-choice, consumer choice. Consumers like variety, they like choices, and I think the more important thing to do is to continue to educate, and we haven't talked about that today. We have a nutrition facts label that nobody can understand. Why don't we do something with that? But instead, we're going to layer on top of that front-of-pack nutrition labeling to make it easier for consumers. And I would argue that depending on what scheme we get, I'm not so sure it's going to be even easier to understand. So I think consumer education, I've been a proponent of getting curriculum into the school systems from the age 2 all the way up on things like the nutrition facts label. In fact, my kids actually brought home the nutrition facts label. They had to understand what a % DV was. They learned about this in their health class. they went to a private school. So I would just say we need to figure out how to educate consumers so they can make the right choices, and they do want to indulge from time to time, and they should have choices out there to indulge.
So again, not my area of expertise, but I will channel the economists in my family. And where I think maybe you're coming from is, one of the things that I worry about, and I think giving consumers education and information is paramount to the success of our system. But we also have food deserts, right? And taxes, particularly those kinds of taxes, tend to be progressive and impact lower income families more than they do higher income families. And that's something, especially when you have a food desert where there aren't other choices necessarily for them to make, we have to think about the unintended consequence of that and how can we mitigate that risk? I mean, I'm not saying not to do it, but we also, in conjunction, have to make sure that we can make other choices available to them so that are affordable and accessible. And so, again, I'll come back and say, this is where we need integrated, holistic approaches that rather than just focusing on one narrow area, and I'm an academic now in my life, and we tend to focus on narrow areas, but we have to think more systematically and holistically about how do we solve this. And I would just come back to the comment that I think that's come up before about consumer behavior, and I think that this is a role FDA could really play, and we called out for it in the Reagan-Udall report, is increased surveillance around consumer knowledge, attitudes, and practices, particularly around these products. And I think that, again, that's an area where we don't have enough research or enough timely research to make informed decisions.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Jerry's coming to the mic.
I'm Jerry Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report. No one has mentioned seafood. There's sort of a constant stream of stories about the lack of inspection of imported seafood. I wonder what your views are on USDA's inspection of imported seafood, and also whether the move of catfish to USDA means that USDA's inspection of catfish is superior to the way FDA approaches it.
I can start because I was actually at FSIS when we took over catfish and we set up the inspection program. Obviously they're very different inspection models, and at FSIS you had an inspector in those catfish processing facilities every day. And I have to say that, some of those had been inspected previously by FDA, and we did find some pretty egregious GMP issues at some of these facilities initially. So that's a different model. The import question, again, they are using, I know FDA I can't speak to it directly, but I know they're using AI and machine learning to screen import entries of seafood, and that they have seen some success in really targeting entries that are problematic. So again, you've got 18 million entries coming in. We do import the majority of our seafood that you eat is imported, and so they use that kind of as a model for how can we, use AI, machine learning to better target those samples where we want to go out and do a physical exam, we want to take a sample, we want to analyze it. And again, they've seen some success there. I believe they did one pilot and they're expanding that pilot. So I think that's about all I can say. HACCP has been around in seafood for years in the FDA space. It took the industry a while to get used to it. There was a lot of non-compliance initially, and the compliance rate did go way up after a couple years of learning. There was a lot of education that went along with seafood HACCP. So I would say I wouldn't be suspect of seafood necessarily, but FDA, again, they don't get out to these facilities very often. They rely a lot on the states. And in some cases, honestly, the states that have big seafood industries, they know the seafood industry, so it's probably a good thing that they're inspecting it. But I'm just not seeing a whole lot of problems with seafood necessarily, like outbreaks with seafood, except your usual, Vibrios with the raw oysters and things like that. I can't remember even of a scombrotoxin in the recent past. So.
I mean, it's certainly not true that because it went to USDA, it's better regulated. I mean, after all, it was a political decision. Let's be honest about it. It was no more or less than that. The senator from, was it Alabama, Mississippi, where, just preferred the USDA regulating it over FDA, and that's why it wound up there. It's irrational and makes no sense at all, but that's what we have. On the other hand, I actually think it's a quite interesting research question. I'd actually like to know, we don't have that happen very often, where a commodity switches from one agency to the other. People have views of these different inspection regimes, as you point out, Roberta, and this is a small test of it, and it might be interesting, actually. Barbara, I'll give you a call after this.
Okay.
To look into that and see if there's anything to be learned.
So I was just going to comment that it was a politically motivated decision, and again, I agree, it is an interesting research question. But I wanted to follow up on something that Roberta mentioned, and that is the new initiatives that FDA have to use machine learning and AI to better target resources for inspection, which, as a data person, I am very much in favor of. I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the vast amount of data that's being collected across the system to inform decision-making better than what we have now. It's going to require investments in IT infrastructure, because getting that data out and sharing it is difficult. Also, there's legal barriers that need to be addressed, and there's some people I can see in the audience who are involved in those activities. But I do want to caution, okay, with AI and machine learning, one of the things, everybody loves to talk about that, and I would bet half of you don't know what it is, but there is potential to build bias into those models, and you have to be very, very careful of what you train those models on, and assessing the bias and fairness in the model, and that's something that actually is going to take more data collection, at least, to be able to assess and make sure that ultimately, whether you're talking about FDA or USDA, everybody's talking about using data better. The industry, that you be cautious about that, and that's not something that I've been heard discussed in the context of AI and machine learning too often.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would like to add, FDA has been using predictive analytics in the import arena for 2 decades now. Their predict model, basically what it does, it's pattern recognition. So if they see, if it's coming in from the same facility, importer through the same port, same product, then it will likely be may preceded by the system, which is a bunch of business rules that are sitting behind the entry, the incoming entries. And then, but if it sees something unusual, like, oh, this is a product that's never come in from this country, or it's never come in from this particular registered facility, then that helps them that could trigger a red flag, and then that might be where they expend resources to go do a physical examination or sampling. So again, FDA has been doing that type of, and I would call it, it's probably called machine learning these days, yes, but predictive analytics for 2 decades in the import arena, just because they get so many entries that they have to weed out the stuff that has never been a problem and just zone in on the things that look unusual or new to the import space the imports coming into this country.
Peter, Barbara, Roberta, thank you so much.
Thank you.